Okay. So, dear colleagues and all our fellow travelers of Medanta Echo and Cardiology, my warm welcome on our 10th session this time with the theme of evolving paradigm in clinical cardiology. As you know, the Medanta Echo and Cardiology Today and Tomorrow is held every year in May, in April actually. And because of the lockdown, we are now hosting it every fourth Saturday of every month. And I'm very happy to say that today we have a very distinguished faculty who will take you through very, very important topics, the SGLT2 inhibitors and strain imaging for aortic stenosis. These are day-to-day issues, and this will tell you the evolving paradigm in clinical cardiology. So first and foremost, my honor and duty to introduce you to Dr. S. Shan Mugasundaram. He and I go a long way in life, and Dr. Saab is not only an astute clinician and a keen echo person, but importantly, he has trained a lot of young fellows who are now chairmen in their own rights. He is now the Emeritus Professor of Cardiology at the MGR Medical University and has been a president of the Indian Academy of Echocardiography. So he's an astute clinician who always uses echocardiography uh, whenever required. Also, he's a good teacher. The second faculty that we have is Dr. Abraham. Uh, Dr. Abraham is a senior consultant again from Apollo Hospitals in Chennai. But you know, the main beauty of this gentleman is that he has been a principal investigator for a lot of the trials that we actually read from Odyssey to Improve It to Paragon to Ischemia. These are the studies which we have all read and enhanced our clinical knowledge. And I tell you, some of these studies have actually been so well done that we started doing it, keeping it in clinical practice with the very next day. He's also a national talent search scholar with many publications in index journals and has presented papers at various fora, both nationally and internationally. Dr. Manish Bansal and I have been fellow travelers for much of our lives, and I can only say one thing, Dr. Manish is a very keen research person. He has put clinical cardiology and echocardiography in a single unit, and he's a recipient of numerous awards and honors, including gold medals in pathology, pediatrics, cardiology. But I and he, we shared one thing very keenly, is the early detection and management of atherosclerosis and cardiovascular risk assessment. And this has been something that bothers us every day, and we have keenly worked on this. And of course, he has been an editor-in-chief of Journal of Indian Academy of Echocardiography, the Indian Heart Journal, and he is in the editorial board of an amazing number of journals. With these few words, ladies and gentlemen, and all my colleagues who have been with us through this journey of Medanta Echo and Cardiology Today and Tomorrow, which started 10 years ago, I hand over the mic to my dear friend and clinician and echocardiographer, Dr. S. Shan Mugasundaram. Dr. Shan Mugasundaram, sir, all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Kasriwal. It is a pleasure and pride for me to take part in your program. Though I'm not able to meet you in person, you had thought about me and given me this responsibility, for which I'm quite thankful. Today we have two important topics to discuss. First one is on SGLT2 inhibitors in management of heart failure without diabetes. And the second one is the value of aortic stenosis. You'll all agree with me that heart failure is a very serious ailment with a prognosis much worse than many of the cancers. in spite of progressive advances in therapy, people continue to suffer from repeated hospitalization for worsening of heart failure, and roughly 10% of them die annually. This is such a serious illness, and for 10 years there was a gap in invention of newer therapies for heart failure management. After AC inhibitors, MRAs, and the beta blockers had established their role in heart failure management. Then came in RNA and followed by SGLT2 inhibitors. It is not a molecule of diabetologists. It's not a molecule of cardiologists. I think it is a molecule of all of us. I think we should exploit this molecule to the fullest extent for various reasons. About which Dr. Abraham Oman is going to tell us. Dr. Abraham Oman, please proceed with your presentation.
Unmuting. I hope I'm audible.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for this opportunity. It has been a privilege and pleasure to be part of this wonderful meeting. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I'll be talking about SGLT2 inhibitors in the management of heart failure in non-diabetics. That is the key. These are my disclaimers. These are my disclosures. Exactly 1 month back, May 26, 2021, JAMA Cardiology had a beautiful editorial. And what they said about heart failure management, a Herculean labor. And they talked about the pillars of Hercules. So I think this is a picture of the pillars of Hercules. So I think it's very apt because heart failure management is a major task and can be called as a modern day Herculean labor. The prognosis of heart failure is often described as cancer-like. It is progressive. The importance is that even if they are not very symptomatic, disease progresses in 9 out of 10 patients. Sometimes it's refractory, and number of affected patients is increasing. And within a decade or so, about 30 to 40% of humankind or adult humankind may develop heart failure. That's a huge number. So let us start with the patient. Actually, this is a medical professional. So he had all the issues of being a medical professional and a patient. The 60 years old, hypertensive, had an anterior myocardial infarction 3 years back. Primary PTCA was done to 100% block proximal lady. Ejection fraction before the procedure was about 30. It improved to 35%. He was not exactly happy. He was worried that the stent was occluded, had a check angio done, stent was patent, and he had an ICD put. So he had best of interventional treatment. He's on Ramipril, metoprolol, spironolactone. His heart BP was 104/74. Now he was not very happy about it. 76 heart rate was 76 per minute. BMI was 28. He was very proud of it. Creatinine was 1.4. He was least bothered about it. Potassium was 5.5. He was a little concerned about it. And he came for a regular follow-up visit. There's no signs of fluid overload, and he was normally active. So he was deemed clinically stable. He said he feels fine overall, but occasionally feels breathless after long walks. Now the question is, how would you manage this patient this day? Today is 26th of June, 2021. Make no change in the current treatment plan. That's what he also thought, and his primary care physician also thought he's doing well. And he thought that he had an angioplasty, stent is patent, so coronary artery disease is cured, and ICD is put, so sudden cardiac death is cured. But he still did not understand that there's no absolute cure in cardiology. And modify current medications. He was somewhat up to it, but he was worried about the blood pressure. And he said, okay, everything seems to be okay. And he said he's doing fine. Then the next question is add additional class of drugs like RNA or SGLT2 inhibitors. The challenge with RNA was that blood pressure of 104. Theoretically, you can give, but that's a challenge as in a patient who himself is not very happy about his blood pressure, and the potassium of 5.5 and GFR. GFR is not a contraindication, but it might worsen with RNA. and obviously is not a transplant candidate. So he asked a question, what is my risk of complications or even death? And there are different risk scores, and MAGIC is something I like because it's simple. And there's a principle called KISS, keep it simple and safe. And I fervently try to follow that. And MAGIC is simple risk score, and his risk of dying within 3 years was 17.5%. That was his first shock. Now, I explained to him the Indian heart failure scenario. This is from the Medanta Heart Registry. It's one of the best outpatient heart failure data from our country. And here is Trivandrum Heart Failure Registry, which was admitted patient. Medanta was a outpatient registry. And about more than 50% in the Medanta registry was non-diabetic, whereas about 42% in the Trivandrum Heart Failure Registry were non-diabetic. What happened to these people at 1 year? Medanta, this 1 year mortality was 17.3. Trivandrum Heart Failure Registry, it was 30.8. So it is even worse than the Western MAGIC data. This was truly a shock to the patient, and he asked what more can be done. So we explained about SGLT2 inhibitors. And the first question is, oh, that is a diabetic drug. So the theme of today's talk is SGLT2 inhibitors as heart failure drugs. How did we get there? We got there through two things. One is serendipity. What is serendipity? Occurrence of or development of events by chance in a happy or beneficial way. And like faculty or phenomenon of finding valuable or agreeable things not sought for. And this is the fantastic editorial by Subodh Verma, the serendipitous story of SGLT2 inhibitors in heart failure, because it was looked for due to FDA rule, which is now taken away, that all anti-hyperglycemic drugs should have a cardiovascular safety, and we got great cardiovascular benefit. Next principle is exaptation. Exaptation is a character previously developed, shaped by natural selection for a particular function, is co-opted for a new use. And for example, feathers in the birds, at least some of us may know that it was initially evolved for heat regulation, then for display, and then for flight, which we identify birds with. Similarly, from the apple tree bark, we got fluorescein, SGLT2 inhibitors as an anti-diabetic or anti-hyperglycemic drug, which has become a heart failure drug or a kidney failure drug. So all this started with these trials because FDA mandated. So EMPOWER Outcome, Canvas, DAPA, Declare, and Vertis, these are all diabetic trials. And we are trying to look for cardiovascular safety, and we got huge benefit in cardiovascular death and heart failure hospitalization. And the trend was in the same direction with all these drugs of the group. So then we started one step forward, that is again exaptation. We thought, okay, can we think beyond? And this is from Nature Reviews Cardiology about 6 months back, December 2020. And they said SGLT2 inhibitors, mechanisms of cardiovascular benefit beyond glycemic control. A beautiful article by Martin Covey. And what they said was that in many ways they thought that the benefit could be beyond glycemic control. Because in these trials, which I mentioned, the benefits occurred rapidly after therapy initiation and persisted with ongoing treatment. Speed of onset of benefits and was something which made them think beyond glycemic control, because normal glycemic control, these benefits takes years for its benefit, but we got it in days or weeks. Another, because Parag Outcome was published in 2015, and they looked at patients in that trial who had near normal or HbA1c levels or low baseline HbA1c levels, and people who did not have great HbA1c reduction. And the benefit of empagliflozin was observed independent of both. And similar drugs which had similar benefits on HbA1c levels, like DPP-4 inhibitors, did not have these cardiovascular benefits. So that led on to heart failure trials diabetics as well as non-diabetics. And again, the mechanisms, as the questions asked, very commonly, but every 4 months, a series of mechanisms are postulated. That means we are not very sure of any, but this is the latest or very recently published in Heart, and they divided it into two categories: conventional mechanisms and novel mechanisms. Conventional mechanisms include glycemic control, diuresis, weight loss, and hematocrit. But novel mechanisms include improved myocardial energetics, that's ATP, and the mitochondrial action, improved myocardial ionic homeostasis, autophagy, the famous Milton Packers starvation mimicking hypothesis, and altered adipokine regulation. So without much ado, I will go into the two path-breaking trials in heart failure, which included diabetics and non-diabetics. And I would look at what happened to those who did not have diabetes. So the primary outcome for both diabetes was great. You can see here, this included diabetics and non-diabetics. So the primary outcome of cardiovascular death, heart failure hospitalization, or urgent heart failure visit in DAPA-HF, as well as the Emperor, was significantly reduced, p-value less than 0.001. Numbers needed to treat were very small. But let's look at the people with or without diabetes, published in JAMA 2020. And you can see here, first we'll look at DAPA-HF, then we'll look at Emperor-HF. And in DAPA-HF, 55% of the patients did not have diabetes. And irrespective of the diabetic status, there was benefit. Whether there was diabetes baseline or not, there was benefit. Irrespective of the baseline HbA1c, there was benefit. Whether it was less than 5.6 or more than 6, there were benefits. Then looked at other endpoints like cardiovascular death, heart failure hospitalization, urgent heart failure visit. You can see here both beneficial, and other endpoints like total heart failure hospitalization, cardiovascular death, including first and repeat hospitalizations. We know that repeat hospitalizations increase death, and again, whether or not diabetes benefit. Worsening heart failure event, whether or not heart failure benefit. But you can see something little curious. It is not statistically significant, but numerically more, that in non-diabetics, the benefit was slightly more, maybe a play of chance, because in EMPA, it was the reverse. So irrespective of the baseline HbA1c, there was 5 or 12, there was benefit. And in primary endpoint, as well as cardiovascular death. Again, the question asked by my patient was that, oh, it's a diabetic drug, I will get hypoglycemia. In non-diabetics, in DAPA-HF, there was absolutely no change in the HbA1c. And this is very important. No change in HbA1c, no leaking of sugar in the urine. So urinary infections also would be less. What about the quality of life? Diabetes or no diabetes benefit? What about renal benefit? Diabetes or no diabetes benefit? Most important thing, people are more worried of the safety issues than the benefit. In the COVID era, people are worried about the rare side effects of COVID vaccine than the huge benefit we accrue. Same here with SGLT2 inhibitors. And let's look at the safety events in non-diabetics. And you can see placebo here, DAPA here. So amputations were theoretically less. No hypoglycemia, no ketoacidosis. And look at any serious adverse events, including death, it is actually lesser than placebo. So at least we can say that it has got a placebo-like benefit in non-diabetics. So if you want to conclude about DAPA-HF in non-diabetics, benefits were seen in those with or without diabetes. Once a day therapy, single dose, no need for titration, and no episodes of hypoglycemia or diabetic ketoacidosis. Negligible incidence of amputations. Number needed to treat 21. Benefits seen even in those more than 75. The oldest patient in DAPA-HF was 93 years, and resolution of mechanism of action still needed. And again, there's a question whether this reduced the development of diabetes. Yes, it reduced the development of diabetes, but majority of these patients were pre-diabetic. What about Emperor-HF? And it is exactly the same. This is the time to first event of cardiovascular death or heart failure hospitalization, whether diabetes or no diabetes benefit. Recurrent hospitalization, diabetes or no diabetes benefit. But again, little curiosity in diabetics at a marginally more benefit. The respect of the HbA1c, those benefit. And renal endpoints benefit, the diabetes or no diabetes. HbA1c, no reduction in normoglycemic or pre-diabetic. And Kanad et al. Had a combined meta-analysis, so numbers are more. And you can see here, diabetes, no diabetes, it is virtually superimposable. It is like exactly the same. But so that is, so irrespective of diabetes, there was benefit. So this led to Subodhvama again to say, lead the editorial, two tales, two heart failure trials, one story, one result. So we evolved from prevention of heart failure in diabetes to treatment of heart failure in diabetes to treatment of heart failure in non-diabetics with SGLT2 inhibitors. A very recent publication published in 14 June 2021, and they said that Asians and Black population gets higher benefit with SGLT2 inhibitors. And they said many theories about it, but this is relevant to us because, as I showed before, our mortality, our risk of heart failure events, developing heart failure and developing death after heart failure is much higher. So here we have a drug which is more beneficial in Asians. What about CKD? It's important because our patient GFR was 54. Remember, even though 1.4, he said he was least bothered about it. It was very important. In ARIC, this patients without heart failure, just CKD stage 3, we may see so many patients with creatinine 1.3, 1.4, and GFR when you calculate 60, 62, 55, but they have double the risk of developing heart failure. And magic in patients with heart failure, serum creatinine concentration is one of the 5 most powerful predictors of mortality. And we had DAPA CKD, which showed significant benefit in the primary composite endpoint, renal composite, composite of cardiovascular death, and mortality. Here I will pause because very few things have been shown to reduce mortality, and practically nothing in the CKD scenario, especially the stage 2 or stage 3 scenario. ACARBs reduce renal events, they do not reduce mortality. And back to back, we have two things. We have finerenone and now then the SGLT2 inhibitors will reduce mortality. And this happened with or without type 2 diabetes. And there was a separate analysis, in circulation, and looked at diabetes and non-diabetes, primary outcome, kidney specific outcome, cardiovascular death or hospital admission outcome, everything was there irrespective of diabetic status. And again, this is an important slide. My patient, because he's got heart failure, but he also has stage 2 CKD, stage 3 CKD, sorry. The GFR was 54. He was not very worried about it, 1.3, 1.4. Nobody apparently was too much worried about it. But like for him at that level, on ACARB, within 10 years, he will reach end-stage renal disease, or that is dialysis or kidney transplant. But if you add SGLT2 inhibitors, he gets an additional 15 years. So he's 60 years. Since you combine both, you may have 25 years of dialysis-free or transplant-free life. What more can you ask for? And other trials with or without diabetes, there are many in HFpEF, that is deliver, preserved, acute heart failure, dictate AHF, impulse, and post-MI, we are part of IMPACT MI, DAPA MI going on. So what are the other trials in different aspects of heart failure? Empatropism in non-diabetics. They showed reduced reverse remodeling, embrace heart failure, improved pulmonary artery diastolic pressure in HFrEF and HFpEF, irrespective of diabetes. EMPIRE-HF improved hepatic and peripheral insulin resistance in HFrEF patients, mostly non-diabetics. Imperial, there was the quality of life, consistency, quality of life improvement in HFrEF, but surprisingly not in HFpEF, but it was a short duration study. So this is the position paper from HFA ESC, and is very recent. And they had 9 patient profiles. Time does not permit me to go with each of these, but you can see here SGLT2 inhibitors are in the forefront of every single drug in every single category. And Dr. McMurray and Milton Packer propose a new sequencing, start with beta blockers and SGLT2 inhibitors, then add RNA, then add MRA, add all steps to be achieved in 4 weeks, and very importantly, uptitrate to target doses thereafter. Many times we start all 4 or some of them, but we do not uptitrate, but uptitration is also important. And what is the benefit of SGLT2 inhibitors on the side effect? Because other side effects, our patient had a potassium of 5.5, and will it increase the potassium? No, actually it reduces the potassium. And we can combine with RNA and MRA, and risk of the hyperkalemia is reduced, risk of renal deterioration is reduced, and BP reduction, the mean BP reduction was only 2 millimeters, so 2 to 3, so we can safely give so multiple benefits. And have all 4 is the Uttayam Vadagunathan's paper, and you get 6 to 8 years of extra life. So what is the ideal characteristic of a heart failure drug? 1 pill once a day, 1 dose with no titration. It improving survival and prevents hospitalization, improving quality of life and functional status. Benefits appear rapidly within days to weeks, well tolerated and safe, does not reduce blood pressure, does so very minimally, no adverse renal effects, and improves tolerability of other heart failure medications, accessible and cost effectiveness, not the cost effectiveness. And SGLT2 inhibitors ticks all the boxes in non-diabetics. And my second last slide, but it's a very sobering slide, in that the knowledge and application of SGLT2 inhibitors, even indicated patients by cardiologists, is very low. Even in the West, it's about 10 to 15%, maybe even lesser. And this is something which we have to be very sober and we have to change. So what are the take-home messages? SGLT2 inhibitors are much more than glucose lowering agents in diabetes. They are heart failure and kidney protective agents with glucose lowering effect in diabetics and not in non-diabetics. The last part is not stressed too much. They reduce the risk of heart failure in patients with diabetes and patients with CKD. Even CKD patients without diabetes reduce the risk of heart failure. Now, they reduce the risk of end-stage renal disease in patients with CKD, with or without diabetes. Our patient had CKD, so it is very relevant. And they reduce the risk of hospitalization and death in patients with heart failure, reduced ejection fraction, with or without diabetes. So all 4 are relevant to our patient. They are more than glucose lowering agents. Our patients, it had CKD without diabetes, reduce the risk of heart failure, reduce the risk of end-stage renal disease, risk of hospitalization and death. So SGLT2 inhibitors protect both the heart and the kidneys, and it is a new standard of care in HFrEF and CKD. So I conclude by saying, knowing is not enough, we must apply. Willing is not enough, we must do. Thank you very much for patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Obermann. I think, your presentation was quite information-packed. I wonder how you could give so much of information in the, allotted time to you, very precisely timed delivery of your speech, very, very impressive. I think after I listened to your talk, I have a feeling that all physicians should feel guilty if they don't prescribe SGLT2 inhibitor in management of heart failure. Very nicely presented. I request you to stay with us for some more time. We will now move on to the second part of the talk today, like Dr. Manish, a good friend of mine, a person who balances knowledge, wisdom, and humility very appropriately, is going to talk to us on strain imaging in guiding decision-making in aortic stenosis. Over to you, Manish.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for these kind words. After this very impressive presentation by Dr. Oman, I'm going to talk about a new evolving paradigm in management in cardiology, different from heart failure. Now, as we know, aortic stenosis is the valve lesion which has been studied most extensively over the last 1 or 2 decades. For 2 reasons. One, treatment of aortic stenosis amongst all the valve lesions is most rewarding. And second, introduction of TAVR has catalyzed this field tremendously. However, in spite of this extensive research, exact timing of intervention in patients with severe aortic stenosis who do not have symptoms and do not have LV systolic dysfunction remains debatable. And to highlight this point, I present this example here, something which we come across in day-to-day clinical practice. So this is a 62 years old lady. She had bronchial asthma, sedentary, mild dyspnea. She presented with backache, and during evaluation, she was found to have severe aortic stenosis. So as we can see here, the aortic valve was thickened and the mean gradient was 59, peak gradient 87. So clearly severe aortic stenosis. Her LVEF was 59%. And as I said, she had mild dyspnea. She has bronchial asthma. So it's very difficult to make out whether that the dyspnea that she had was related to asthma or aortic stenosis. But she did not come with symptoms suggestive of aortic stenosis. It was only an incidental diagnosis. So going by the current guidelines, she is not a candidate for aortic valve surgery at this point of time. But is this entirely appropriate? So this is what we are going to discuss. So first, let us go back to the natural history of aortic stenosis, which has been derived from studies conducted nearly 5 decades ago. At that time, aortic valve replacement was not available. So we could have pure natural history of aortic stenosis. So these studies told us that patients with aortic stenosis, that is severe aortic stenosis, they enjoy a good 10 to 15 years of symptom-free period. And then when they develop symptoms, the outcome suddenly becomes rapid downhill. And depending on the type of symptom that the patient develops, whether it's angina, syncope, or heart failure, the median survival is 2 to 5 years. LV systolic dysfunction usually occurs much later after the onset of symptoms, somewhere here in the course of the natural history of aortic stenosis. Now, as per the current guidelines, only 2 class 1 indications for aortic valve intervention in aortic stenosis are development of symptoms or drop in ejection fraction. Now, these recommendations are based on the understanding that when these events develop in a patient with severe aortic stenosis, the risk of not operating becomes far more as compared to risk of doing aortic valve replacement. And that is why these recommendations are there. However, we should remember that this is not clinical equipoise, because when the patients develop these events, that is either development of symptoms or drop in LVEF, at that point of time, it is not that the risk of not doing AVR only marginally outweighs the risk of doing AVR. Rather, the risk of not doing AVR far outweighs the risk of doing AVR. So this is not actually the appropriate time for intervention. We should be intervening in these patients much earlier, somewhere here. But the problem is that we don't have any good tool to identify the time point in the natural history when the risk of not doing intervention becomes more than the risk of doing intervention. And that has been the major challenge so far. The guidelines have recommended several parameters to overcome this challenge. This is the latest ACC/AHA guideline, which recommends exercise test or looking at peak aortic velocity more than 5 meters per second, BNP levels, or serial testing to look at the rate of rise in aortic velocity or change in LVEF to predict who are the patients who could be taken up for aortic valve replacement as class 2A or class 2B indication. So these are the tools that we can use, but we could do much better than this. Now, coming back to LVEF less than 50%, which has been one of the class 1 indications for years for AVR in patients with severe aortic stenosis, there are many evidences which tell us that this threshold is too late in the natural history of these patients. First, if you look at this data from Mayo Clinic, nearly 10,000 patients who had severe AS, only 43, that is 0.4% patients actually had LVEF less than 50% and were asymptomatic, which means that asymptomatic severe AS with LVEF less than 50% virtually does not exist. So any patient who develops EF, whose EF drops to below 50% will no longer be asymptomatic. So this itself tells that these two indications do not go with each other. Secondly, this is the latest recommendation from the American Society of Echocardiography regarding chamber quantification, and it says that any patient whose EF is less than 53% has LV systolic dysfunction. Now here in AS, in whom we expect EF to be supernormal, we are using 50% as the threshold for defining LV systolic dysfunction, which is counterintuitive. The threshold should be much higher. But the more robust evidence comes from this study, which looked at more than 2,000 patients who had already undergone surgical AVR for severe aortic stenosis. Now, in this study, the investigators looked at baseline EF categories and 10-year outcome. So they found that the patients whose EF at baseline was 60 to 69% or more than 70%, they had same 10-year mortality as the general population in that community. This study was again from Mayo Clinic, so this was the reference was Minnesota white population. So patients who had undergone AVR, in spite of having had this disease and having undergone surgery, their overall survival was same as general population. But those who had EF 50 to 59% or EF less than 50%, their survival was much worse, which means that the patients who develop mild LV systolic dysfunction in the range of 50 to 59% before they undergo AVR for severe AS, they are already at jeopardy, and their survival is not going to be same as would be expected for a general population. Why this happens so? So when severe aortic stenosis develops, it puts afterload on the left ventricle. In response to that, LV myocardium undergoes hypertrophy. Initially, this is because of myocyte hypertrophy. Later on, there is extracellular expansion because of deposition of collagen fibers. This is known as ECV expansion, and it is reversible, but it compromises contractile function. But later, if afterload is not removed, this excess afterload, then it leads to myocyte apoptosis, cell injury, and replacement fibrosis, which significantly worsens contractile function. And this is an irreversible step in the remodeling of left ventricle that occurs in these patients. And when replacement fibrosis occurs, it is associated with much worse long-term survival as compared to patients who do not have any fibrosis or even those who have just ECV expansion. This MRI study shows that this replacement fibrosis is irreversible, even if there is hardly mild fibrosis to begin with. So 58 patients here who underwent surgery for isolated severe AS. We have patients without any fibrosis, mild fibrosis, and severe fibrosis. This is baseline in 9 months. These white boxes show patients who had late gadolinium enhancement, which indicates fibrosis. As we can see in all these three categories of patients, there was no change in the extent of late gadolinium enhancement, even after 9 months of surgery, even in those patients who had only mild or no fibrosis to begin with, which means that once replacement fibrosis occurs, it is irreversible. Now, unfortunately, LVEF is not able to pick up any of these. In fact, LVEF is a very crude measure of LV systolic function, particularly in a condition like aortic stenosis. The reason is that if you look at how we calculate LVEF, it is just the ratio of stroke volume to end diastolic volume. So if there is any condition in which end diastolic volume is significantly reduced, then even if there is marked reduction in stroke volume, EF is going to remain normal. And this example here highlights this very dramatically. As we can see here, the patient has severe LVH. LV end diastolic volume is 52 ml. Stroke volume is 41 ml, which is not index value. So if we index it, it is going to be much lower than the normal threshold of 35. but EF is still close to 80%. So EF will be misleading in this patient, and high EF is only because of markedly reduced end diastolic volume, not because of good contractile function of the left ventricle. Now, if we divide stroke volume by myocardial volume instead of EDV, we can have much better idea of the contractile function of the myocardium. And this ratio is known as myocardial contractile function, once again proposed by Dr. Milton Packer and group. So this is a better representative of LV contractile function. However, it is difficult to calculate. Global longitudinal strain, which we use routinely, provides the same information in a much simpler manner, and it correlates very well with myocardial contractile function. So in this patient, MCF is only 14%, normal would be at least 20%. So it indicates significant myocardial dysfunction. And if you look at GLS, it is minus 10%. Once again, it shows that there is significant myocardial dysfunction, which we will not be able to pick up if we look at only LVEF. There are several studies which have shown prognostic value of GLS in patients with severe aortic stenosis. Here we have data from 294 patients who were followed up for all-cause mortality for 2 years. Now, the red line indicates patients who had normal EF and whose LV-GLS was relatively preserved. That was more than 14-15%, more negative than that. And here we have people who had impaired LVEF, that is less than 55%. As we can see, patients who had impaired LVEF, their prognosis was much worse. But if we look at patients who had normal EF, that is more than 55%, but reduced GLS, their prognosis was also as bad as patients who had impaired LVEF. And this shows how powerful GLS is as a predictor of outcome in severe aortic stenosis. Now, more recently, we had a large study. It was a meta-analysis of 10 studies with more than 1,000 patients. This included only those patients who had significant AS and had EF more than 50%, which is what we are talking about. So in this, 2/3 of the patients had EF more than 60%. So these would not be candidate for surgery at all by any criteria. Now, even though they had 2/3 of the patients had absolutely normal LVEF, mean GLS in this population was only 16%, which indicates reduced LV contractile function. And only 15% patients had GLS above 20%, which would be considered normal. Now, when GLS values were plotted against outcome, the patients were followed up for 2 to 4 years, and median follow-up was roughly 2 years. Over these 2 years, crude mortality rate was 8.5% per year. So when GLS was plotted against mortality, they found that the moment GLS dropped to below 15%, there was steep rise in mortality. So this means that 15% is the threshold below which prognosis worsens suddenly. So this is the inflection point in the natural history, and this could be used as a threshold for identifying patients who are going to fare worse. Now, there is a pathological basis behind the prognostic value of GLS, and that is that GLS correlates very well with myocardial fibrosis. As I mentioned in the earlier slides, that myocardial fibrosis is the main culprit, which is responsible for poor outcome in these patients. So if you look at this study, MRI study, on this axis we have myocardial fibrosis. Here we have extracellular volume calculated by MRI, native T1 by MRI, and GLS. We'll find that all the three parameters had same strength of correlation with myocardial fibrosis, which means GLS was as good as these two MRI parameters for predicting myocardial fibrosis. This is another study showing the same thing, collagen component versus GLS, excellent correlation. And importantly, GLS less than 15% had 100% sensitivity and 88% specificity for predicting myocardial fibrosis more than 30%. That is the reason why GLS appears to be a very good predictor of outcome in these patients. So based on these evidences, several investigators have proposed that GLS could be used for decision making in patients with severe aortic stenosis. If in a patient whose EF is more than 50%, we should look at GLS. If it is more negative than 18%, then we can keep the patient under follow-up every 1 to 2 years. If GLS is between 15 to 18%, closer follow-up is needed. If it is less than 15%, we should do MRI. If MRI is normal, we can again keep the patient under follow, but very close follow-up is needed because this patient is going to worsen very soon. However, if there are myocardial abnormalities on MRI also, then it would be better to recommend this patient surgery. So if we go back to our patient, this patient had EF 59%, severe aortic stenosis. If you look at her GLS, it was minus 15%. So she had already reached the threshold where surgery would be indicated. Now, unfortunately, the current guidelines do not recommend use of GLS for decision making in aortic stenosis. Even the most recent ACC/AHA guidelines did not include GLS. The main reason is that even though we have a lot of prognostic data, a lot of evidences showing correlation of GLS with fibrosis, and the evidence which shows that the presence of contractile dysfunction prior to AVR is associated with worse outcome. The main problem is that we do not have any outcome study with GLS, which has shown that GLS guided treatment strategy improves prognosis. So just because of this reason, GLS is currently not included in the guidelines, and it is time to have such kind of study to improve management of these patients. This is a very thought-provoking editorial by Dr. Jim Thomas in JAMA Cardiology 3 years ago. However, there is one more aspect to all this discussion. This I've taken from the recent ACC/AHA guideline, and the guideline document clearly mentions that when patients present with severe aortic stenosis, which means aortic velocity is more than 4 meters per second, and the patients are asymptomatic, then even in them, rate of progression to symptoms is high, and event-free survival rate is only 30 to 50% at 2 years, which means that 50 to 70% of these patients who are asymptomatic today will undergo AVR within next 2 years. So if it is going to be a matter of only 2 years, then why to wait? Why not use GLS and send them for surgery a little earlier, which will improve prognosis? And also, if we wait, we run at the risk of missing symptoms because symptom onset is insidious and patients may not recognize these symptoms and they may present late to us, which can worsen their prognosis significantly. So using GLS in these patients, if at all, it will predate surgery or prepone surgery by at the most 2 years, but has the potential to improve prognosis considerably. So to summarize, GLS less than 15% is a strong predictor of adverse outcomes in patients with severe AS with preserved LVEF. AVR in such patients, in the absence of other indication, should improve clinical outcomes, but this needs to be proven in outcome studies. Nevertheless, GLS less than 15% in patients who are apparently asymptomatic should at least prompt a careful workup and a very close follow-up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manish. My mentor used to say that a good physician should be a good advocate also. I think you could build your case so nicely that the judge has to pass an order that the decision for aortic stenosis surgery, we don't need to wait for guidelines. I think we should go ahead with the GLS value to decide about the timing of surgery. Before we go to the chat box to answer the questions posed by the listeners, I would like to get the comments from Dr. Kasliwal on both the topics. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I think these have been outstanding talks. I mean, what more can I say? And both these gentlemen have done such a fantastic job in a limited period of time that you are absolutely right that, those physicians who are not using DAPA up till now will feel bad and sad that why haven't they used it till now? because you don't have to worry about the diabetic status or the non-diabetic status or the potassium levels, overwhelming data. So that is why we had named this thing as new paradigms in cardiology, and both our speakers have done exceedingly well. One thing that came out of Dr. Oman's lecture was that less than 15% of cardiologists are actually using DAPA in heart failure. This is shocking. This is truly shocking. With a disease, with a molecule which is neither causing hypotension or hypertension or anything else, and very, very importantly, many people say, yeah, this is going to give urinary tract infection to my patients. It's not happening so in non-diabetic patients. So this is an amazing piece of work. As far as Dr. Manish Bansal's exposition on aortic stenosis, it's absolutely clear that ejection fraction is no way to go. And one example which he has shown is striking. If you see one lady who was president of the American Society of Echocardiography talked of aortic stenosis at one point of time with ejection fraction, and the same person is actually now talking of global longitudinal strain. Number two, you brought out very wonderfully, Manish, that myocardial fibrosis is something which, because we can't see it, so we don't talk about it, but GLS takes us there. That is the reason why you may do any amount of stress tests in aortic stenosis, anything, but the thing which will help the patient, because he's going to get it, he has to get it done anytime. That if we had done a carefully done, performed global longitudinal strain, that's all you need to give new life to this person. Because I've read that Olmsted County data, those who had ejection fraction, 70% had actually same lifespan as those who did not have aortic valve replacement. And mind you, these are not TAVR patients. These are patients with valvular aorta. So they actually underwent a open heart surgery. So I think I congratulate, and these are my comments, Dr. Shanmugh Sundaram, that they put it so succinctly that these talks could actually have been on an international forum. And since this is on YouTube, many people will follow it later. So my heartiest congratulations to my two colleagues who have done a fabulous job. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I agree with you. There was an interesting paper some time ago. They looked at the usage of SGLT2 inhibitor among various categories. I was under the impression that it's going to be the diabetologists who are going to top the list, but it's the other way around. The primary care physicians topped the list of using SGLT2 inhibitors, right, followed by cardiologists. Unfortunately, the diabetologists came at the end. I think that's why I said, it's a molecule of all of us. I think we should use it very appropriately in managing people with heart failure. Dr. Oman, there are a few questions for you. Can we use this drug as, for prevention of progression of CKD?
Answer is very emphatic, yes, because the rate of iteration has been shown, and the proof of pudding in science is repetition. So we saw in Credence, we saw in DAPA CKD, so that we can reduce the rate of deterioration in diabetics and non-diabetics. And I showed that wonderful cartoon where you get extra 15 years from end-stage renal disease, that is dialysis or kidney transplant. So if a person with GFR of around 60 is taking ACE inhibitors or ARBs plus SGLT2 inhibitors, he may have 25 years free from dialysis and renal transplant. Only as of now, the cutoff for starting, or GFR cutoff for starting SGLT2 inhibitors are becoming lower and lower. So it has become to 30. DAPA CKD was 25. Emperor was 20. I think it will, but there will be a small gap between the study publication and the guidelines and the approvals, but it will come down. And so in almost all stages of CKD, they may be beneficial. Less than 15 or 20, it's still questionable.
Thank you, Abraham. Dr. Manish, there is a question which is slightly out of your topic of presentation. If there is a place where echo is not available, can you estimate ejection fraction based upon ECG?
I don't think that we can estimate EF from ECG. I don't think so.
Maybe like, if the ECG shows, QS complexes in all the
Yes.
precursor leads, or if the ECG shows left atrial enlargement, or if the ECG shows LVB, probably you can think that patient may have LV dysfunction, but you can't be sure about the
we cannot estimate EF.
presence of LV dysfunction or the magnitude of LV dysfunction.
We can just say that there could be LV problem.
Right. Dr. Oman, can we use SGLT2 inhibitors in acute heart failure with or without diabetes? And if so, is there any difference in using this drug in acute versus chronic heart failure?
Okay, so as of now, these all the major trials published have been in patients with chronic heart failure. But now we are coming closer and closer to acute heart failure. I showed a slide where their two studies are ongoing, and so the results of those studies are important. But the question is not that. So somebody comes with acute heart failure, can it replace diuretics? I don't think so unless we get an IV preparation. But what we are going towards is early initiation. So almost all the newer papers are talking about initiating SGLT2 inhibitors pre-discharge when the patient is reasonably stable. When the patient is reasonably stable, and maybe on the third or fourth day pre-discharge, if you start SGLT2 inhibitors, that would be very good. The reason is that if you start pre-discharge, chance of them being continuously on that drug, especially when a situation where you do not you have a drug which does not require titration, then patient will continue to be on the drug. So that is the importance. So what I do, and even Dr. McMurray also says the same thing, it's like pre-discharge, when the patient is reasonably stable, we start, and single dose, so there is no difference. So the patient continues on SGLT2 inhibitors. With the specific trials, maybe we'll start earlier, and we have trials in acute MI. They're also, very soon we'll have the absolute answer to that.
I think, based on this Solace WHF trial, I think, we can use it, at the earliest opportunity when you treat somebody with acute heart failure. Either pre-discharge or within 1 or 2 days of discharge, the drug has been, given, and obviously, this drug is hemodynamically well tolerated. So you don't need to worry about the presence of congestion or the presence of low blood pressure. I think you should start at the earliest opportunity. I agree with Dr. Roman totally. Dr. Keshav has asked one more question to you, Dr. Roman. Is there any condition where we cannot use SGLT2 inhibitors in heart failure, or rather acute heart failure?
Actually, there's a very interesting question. If you really see the insert and what is absolute contraindication, it's very interesting. Absolute contraindication is hypersensitivity or anaphylaxis to SGLT2 inhibitors, which is hardly ever reported. But where I would not start, or I would wait for some time, are one clinically unstable patient. So patient and maybe on a diuretics, IV diuretics and inotropes, I may wait. The fluctuating GFR, in the sense like AKI, and very immediately after recovery from AKI. For example, yesterday it was 3.5, now it has come to 1.7, even though it is within the GFR limits of prescription, I would wait. Then people who had, especially diabetics, who had multiple UTIs with SGLT2 inhibitors, it's another situation where I would be little careful. The most commonly asked thing is about the amputation. If the patient has got ongoing very bad diabetic or vascular insufficiency, acute vascular insufficiency, and ulcer, I may wait till it's stabilized. Even in the trials, the part of diabetic foot was not a contraindication, but a decompensated state was a contraindication. So these are the things we have to use our common sense. It's a very well tolerated drug, but the problem is the creatinine on the rising aspect, and you start that and the creatinine worsens. Patients and the primary care physicians may get an aversion to it, and patient may never get a life-saving drug.
I mean, since this drug has been used in people with EGFR of at least more than 30, what's your opinion on using this in people who have lesser than EGFR of less than 30 or less than 25?
Yeah, I was part of the trials which allowed up to 20. So I had good experience in that. And there is the 2 points. One thing, when the GFR comes down, they are no longer good anti-hypertensive. The diabetic or blood sugar reductions are minimal, but the kidney protection and the heart protection continues. So if the GFR is low, for as an anti-diabetic drug, it is practically useless. But as a kidney protection, heart failure protection, they are useful. And there is one trial with GFR of up to 15. I don't think it will go below that, but I'm certain that with the DAPA-CKD and other trials up to 25, the cutoff will come to at least 20 or 25.
Okay. Dr. Manish, what level of fibrosis and CMR for aortic stenosis is of concern?
Since fibrosis on CMR, we can assess either by quantifying ECV expansion using T1 map, or we can look at late gadolinium enhancement. So LGE is more commonly used, which shows replacement fibrosis. Normally, in ventricles, there should not be any LGE. So if there is even 5 to 10% LGE, it should indicate that there is a fair degree of replacement fibrosis going on. Regarding ECV expansion, I think 30% is what indicates extensive fibrosis, will definitely indicate that there is a lot of problem happening and patient should be sent for surgery.
And again, one more question which is outside your topic, but I think, you should try to answer this. Opinion of surgery and TAVR, what to be preferred and in which patients? Maybe you can give a brief overview of, this question.
So regarding, first thing is whether the patient needs aortic valve intervention or not. And second is what type of intervention. So now with the recent studies showing TAVR having almost same outcome as even low risk patients, the use of TAVR has increased significantly. So if the person is elderly, where we are going to use a tissue valve, bioprosthetic valve, then in high surgical risk patient and intermediate surgical risk patients, TAVR today has become the preferred option. In low risk, TAVR still remains the preferred option. But the cost, availability, and other things need to be looked into.
Dr. Roman, is there any experience of using this drug in benign prostatic hypertrophy grade 4? Some have reported worsening of lower urinary symptoms.
Yeah, it is like two parts of that. How much excess maturation these drugs produce? That has been looked into, and the answer is 1 or 2. So it doesn't produce polyuria, and usually it settles in the first week itself. So person with benign prostatic hypertrophy, and as it is, they have increased frequency. Whether it will increase the frequency, answer is not much. Second, does the patient with urinary retention, will it increase the chance of cystitis And the studies have shown in non-diabetics, obviously, it doesn't matter. In diabetics, practically, it's not being shown because these are our elderly people. So if you see the studies, the discontinuation, I showed that slide in DAPA-HF, discontinuation due to any reasons were very, very less. And people can discontinue. Somebody feels that they cannot tolerate it due to that, they can, but the discontinuation was very low in spite of being an elderly group, and majority of them will have a prostatic hypertrophy. So my answer is the benefit far, far, far outweighs the risk, but is individual cases will I take as individual outliers.
Manish, can GLS value differ based upon the sonographer?
One good thing about GLS is that it is more reproducible than most of the echo parameters, certainly more reproducible than LVEF. So from sonographer to sonographer, if the person is adequately trained, then the variability should not be much. So the most crucial factor here would be training. But as I said, it is much more reproducible than any other echo parameter.
I agree with you because, for EF, for that matter, some users still use M-mode echocardiography. One uses only single, apical four chamber alone for EF measurement. Very rarely people use biplane, technique. I think it is definitely more reproducible measurement than ejection fraction.
Yeah. So even compared with biplane Simpson's method, it is much more reproducible. It's as reproducible as 3D-EF or MRI-EF, which is what studies have shown.
Can you just comment on vendor-to-vendor difference?
So earlier there used to be significant vendor-to-vendor difference in strain values. This difference has become much less now because of the changes in the instrumentation and technology used for strain estimation by different vendors, because of the efforts of a collaboration developed by ASC, EACVI, and industry. So this task force has worked on this aspect and has minimized these differences significantly. But even then, in a same patient, for serial monitoring, we should use the same equipment and same software version.
Dr. Oman, this is from me rather. Do you think that time has come that we should start using it in people with asymptomatic LV dysfunction, this SGLT2 inhibitors?
I think so, because see, we have some data from, basically we go back to EMPA-REG outcome. EMPA-REG outcome had a certain set of people who are reported, the physicians reported them to have heart failure, so they might be having symptoms. But there may be a good subset of people, if you calculate the heart failure risk, they may be having asymptomatic heart failure, or which is not picked up, and there was benefit. So we are moving in that direction. So, and again, we saw studies where with remodeling and reduction in the PA pressures. So if they're a diabetic patient, for prevention of heart failure, yes, suppose the person has just the risk factors except diabetes. Diabetes, another beast altogether. Then we'll have to look into all aspects, including GLS. Many a times, the importance of GLS is that there's one study showed that there's in diabetics, but 20-25% of the people had reduced systolic function by GLS at presentation. So GLS, I think, even though the topic was on aortic stenosis, one of the another great modality which should be used much more frequently. So my short answer is yes, we have data only on that subgroup. Answer is no. But if you extrapolate and use our logic, answer is yes.
Thank you. Dr. Manish, given the choice, which one you would prefer, GLS or pro-BNP measurement in, deciding about optimal timing of surgery for people, not only aortic stenosis, all the other valvular diseases like AR, mitral regurgitation, etc.
Sir, although the guideline has recommended BNP, the recent guideline, I would be inclined to use GLS more frequently, mainly because I've seen significant variability in BNP values. And if although they are cutoff values, if you look at the positive predictive value and specificity, it's going to be questionable. So if BNP is normal, it would indicate very low LV strain. But elevated BNP, the range is going to be wide, and choosing a particular threshold, guideline mentioned more than 3 times normal. My personal answer preference would be GLS.
Okay. I would also go with you. Like, I do routine measurement of BNP in people with severe MR, severe AR, and severe aortic stenosis on follow-up when they have no symptoms. But I've always found that, GLS, gives you a little better idea, probably an earlier, indication that, patient should go for surgery. I'm also for, basing my decision on surgical intervention or device intervention based upon GLS value. I think Dr. Kasliwal is busy otherwise.
He had to go to emergency for a patient.
I think we're just close to 4:15. I think then I should thank Medanta, particularly Dr. Kasliwal and Dr. Manish Bansal, for having given me this opportunity to share the platform with two of the good speakers I've ever known. Like, both of them are experts in their own fields. I think, both of them, delivered very excellently. There are a lot of take-home points. As Dr. Kasliwal said, you should feel sad if you don't prescribe by SGLT2 inhibitor in people with heart failure, irrespective of presence of diabetes. Similarly, you should also feel sad if you don't do GLS in people with valvular heart diseases to decide about surgical intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And on behalf of Dr. Kasliwal, I would like to thank both of you for accepting this invitation and for sparing time to be here with us and gracing this meeting. Dr. Oommen delivered a wonderful presentation, as was expected from him. And the topic was very, very focused, non-diabetic SGLT2 inhibitor, SGLT2 inhibitors for non-diabetics. And I'm sure the attendees would be greatly benefited from his presentation. And sir, your overall insight and moderation of this whole program was just wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, both of you, for being with us. We look forward to many more interactions with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.